You'll be glad to know I'm not going to do any talking in this section. The chair in this session is merely facilitator because it's a chair of chairs. And not all the chairs are full, so we're going to start with Richard. No, we won't. What we're hoping to do is that each chair will summarise the main points or queries or questions or issues from their sessions. And then as we ask each chair to summarise, we then open it to the floor for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and the next chair will do a summary. So Marion Palmer chaired our session this morning on assessment and standards. So Marion will now summarise the main points from that session.
Right. Right. Good morning. I hope I remember this. As you know, I dashed out and I'm back again to try and remember it. First of all, very interesting session, very engaging, and I'd like to thank our two case studies, which are in fact Eileen and Naomi, for just highlighting the key issues. I think the key, there were some very interesting and good questions, and I think the thing comes back to the role of learning outcomes and the key need for learning outcomes to be owned by the programme, particularly at programme level, and the quality assurance process makes sure that they are reflect the award standards and reflect the appropriate NFQ level, but to be owned. Eileen put it very succinctly, I think, at one stage, is for us as lecturers to realise that QA systems and learning outcomes provide a liberating framework in which we have considerable freedom, provided we honour the contract with the students, which I always argue is the learning outcomes. So it's taking that view and sort of seeing that shift, and I think Marion talked about a cultural shift, it's that shift from covering content and to enable the learner to learn and to achieve the learning outcomes, and that matching of the learning outcomes. There were considerable questions about, how do you engage the learner? Can you do integrated assessments? Can you change learning outcomes? And there were sort of some of the key issues, the questions that came up in the session. So really it was looking at what do learning outcomes mean, what does it mean in practice, particularly for that, and the other one is the key role of the programme assessment strategy and getting people talking about assessment. And I think one thing I would like to add is that, having a group of lecturers actually sit down, talk about assessment and say, I understand assessment to be this. What's formative assessment? What's summative assessment? What learning outcomes mean? Why do we only have 6 learning outcomes? Because that's plenty. Do I have to cover all the content in the module? How many assessments should we give students? And matching it up to student workload. And I think the gentleman from Kimmage Development Centre said, highlighted that as a key point, that the programme assessment strategy is a wonderful strategy for developing an understanding of assessment in that. And that understanding assessment has to be developed at programme level, at module level, and indeed by the students. Now I hope those of you who were there feel I've captured some of the key issue. I think one of the things is it's a very, very complex document, assessment and standards. There's a lot of really important ideas in it. So we really probably touched the surface. But ownership, student engagement, and the value of the programme assessment strategy.
So the take-homes from that are some of us can go back to our own institutions and now sit together and look at programme assessment strategies. But we've got to be aware that there are people who may be going back to a very small institution and may need to collaborate to talk to other institutions, so we can offer help to each other. So that's another takeaway. So have we any questions and answers from the group? Have we covered everything? Too late. Well then, without further ado, we will move on to the first session on programmatic review in the afternoon, and Naomi was the chair for this session.
Okay, thank you, Eileen. I feel like I need to stand up now just to follow suit. This afternoon session then we looked at the provider monitoring policy and in particular programmatic review within that. As I said to the people who were in the group, I wasn't there as I was deemed to be the expert on it, but merely because I have chaired a programmatic review and been on the other side of the table under this new policy just over recent weeks. So it's very fresh in my mind and I have the perspective of both parties, I suppose. What came across from the discussion was I suppose in some ways Paul had stolen our thunder in his presentation around institutional review, because as you would hope, a lot of the same types of issues and comments came forward around focusing on documentation, being genuinely reflective. Don't be descriptive, don't focus on what you do. Tell us what you do, how you do it, why you do it that way, is it effective, how do you know, what changes do you make? And you know, we placed a lot of emphasis on the importance of the actual self-evaluation activity as well as the report itself. I suppose other areas we looked at were trying to develop a genuine quality improvement culture, so that programmatic review doesn't just become something that you do to yourselves every 5 years. It's something that you are working towards continually. I was certainly felt from those of us that have the experience of programmatic review that if you could develop systems and processes within your institution that support programmatic review, that are part of your standard QA, then it wouldn't seem such a burdensome process when the time comes. It was acknowledged that it is very time consuming, there is an awful lot to consider and a number of different voices of different stakeholders to take into account. I'm just trying to think of the other points that came up. I suppose the panel construction and membership what seemed to be a particular issue. It was felt that there really is great importance to be placed upon the type of panel member that you get, that they would understand the culture of your organisation and the way that your organisation operates, but also that they have a broad vision in terms of a broad vision for your institution and a broad vision in terms of programmatic review, that they are not just there to focus on what lessons you teach within what module, or indeed what modules you would have within a particular programme. They would have the broader vision. There was also the issue of what programmatic review can do. So there did appear to be a lack of clarity as to whether you can validate minor awards, etc. And in some instances an understanding of what constitutes a minor award. I think just important to recognise that there's a broad spectrum of providers here today. Some people who are only at the stage of seeking ETAC recognition, so some of these things will be very new to them. I think that was roughly everything that we covered, but if anyone else within the group has something else to add, please do.
I wasn't at that group, so I assume there was a lot of collaboration and offers of help. People offering their own perspectives on programmatic review.
There was certainly a lot of sharing of ideas. I think it seemed to be more that people were trying to glean information from those that had been through the process. I got the sense that those people who are experienced in the process were perhaps those more experienced in the process were perhaps partaking in other groups, and there were a lot more newer providers, or providers who are still in their first 5 years at least, wanting to gain more information about the policy.
So another thing, a takeaway from today is that we are prepared to help one another, even if we're just trying to glean information, but just share experience as much as we can. The next session was the Assessment Appeals Policies and Processes, and Diarmuid O'Callaghan from Blanchardstown.
Thanks. Our session, before we ever got in to consider assessment appeal policies, considered a bit about how you might go about reducing the number of appeals that would be presented to you to deal with in the first place, because they do become very labour intensive, and in part of the conversations it was clearly established that if you were south of the Liffey and you had law courses and you had learners whose parents were barristers, you were in deep trouble with regard to assessment appeals. But those of us that are not in that box, we don't have as much problems in that regard. We had contributions from Tomás with regard to Griffith College experiences, and from Leo Casey on some experience of NCI. I suppose at the start we worked through some of the characteristics that an effective exam appeal process should have. So we all have exam appeal processes, but are they effective? Are they fit for purpose? If you were a student, would you think they are as good as you do as a college administrator or academic in terms of they being fit for purpose for quality assurance purposes? And having worked through some of the fundamental characteristics, we moved on to test the boundaries of the exam appeal processes with specific cases. where some of the more awkward cases we've had to deal with were worked up a little bit to see whether we could accommodate them within our own existing processes. We moved from there to the issue which, when it wasn't specifically exam appeals but gets associated with it quite rapidly, would be around cheating and penalties for misbehaviour, if you like. The issues around plagiarism and what is actual active plagiarism as distinct from an accident of events or misunderstandings, and how you deal with that type of an issue within the exam results that are being returned. So we worked through some of those issues, and I think some of the notes that come out at the end might articulate some of that conversation in a bit more detail. I think one of the take-home messages that I took out of it was some of the comments of individuals where if you feel there's something wrong, there probably is. And so if a student is making a case and you just don't feel comfortable with it, well then you probably want to investigate it more. And certainly what I have found is where a student keeps after you and isn't satisfied with the result you're giving them, they are probably right. And again, they need to get more attention paid to them, and don't dig a fucking great big hole for yourself by staying with the original decision. If it's wrong, be prepared to go back and visit it again. So that was pretty much a whistle-stop tour through the workshop.
I was at that one, and that was very fair. It was also interesting and reassuring to know that you're not the only one with D4 law students whose parents are at the bar. We've got them at DBS as well. But it's fascinating. I mean, I think sometimes they're doing it as a case study themselves, bringing it through the process. And you can be confident at the end of it. But I think what you said there, the balancing of the process, the robust process, with the humanity and, you know, just knowing. Have we any comments, other comments from the floor? Arian?
If I could just echo what Dermot said, I think if we go back to what assessment is, it is fundamentally a judgment. Well, you can try and make it as objective as possible, but it's fundamentally a judgment. So if you say to your students, this is my judgment of your work on these criteria, if you have a question about that, come back to me and make an argument. And if they make, as Dermot said, if they make a valuable argument, and if you are, I make that offer to my fourth years all the time and say, now you can do it within the next week. After a week, I'm not going to listen to it because it's not that important if you haven't done it straight away. And one or two students have done it and they've come back with a very clear argument, I think this is the grade I should get. And actually, sometimes I said, yeah, you're right, you make a good argument. So, and that in itself solves a lot of appeal problems. And I think that, you know, I'm with Dermot, cut the appeals down to as few as you can get.